All right, welcome back. We are in part 11 of Where Did the Book of Mormon Come From? So, we've been talking about Solomon Spaulding, and we want to see, is there a connection between him and Sidney Rigdon? Was Rigdon in the right place at the right time to have stolen the manuscript? Was he given the right opportunity to do so? We want to recognize that he is innocent until proven guilty. And there are several people who came forward and said that Sidney Rigdon was indeed innocent. So I want to bring some of those people out now. So this is Samuel Cooper, veteran of 3 wars, in a letter to the present writer, dated June 14th, 1879, stated as follows. I was acquainted with Mr. Lambton, was often in the printing office, was acquainted with Silas Ingalls, the foreman of the printing office. He never mentioned Sidney Rigdon's name to me, so I am satisfied he was never engaged there as a printer. I was introduced to Sidney Rigdon in 1843. He stated to me that he was a Mormon preacher or lecturer. I was acquainted with him during 1843 to 1845. Never knew him before, never knew him as a printer. Never saw him in the bookstore or printing office. Your father's office was in the celebrated Molly Murphy's Row. Then we have Isaac Craig, who wrote this. Reverend Robert Patterson, dear sir, I have received the history of Washington County some time ago, but had not, on account of the condition my eyes are in, read your account of the origin of the Book of Mormon. To comply with your request, I had it read to me late last night, and I think you have made good use of the materials at hand, and I believe the spirit in which it is written is the proper one to command the attention of honest Mormons. Mrs. Eigbaum's statement to you is a surprise to me for 2 reasons, in which you can find her statement there. And then goes on to say, 1, because I called on her to learn if she could throw any light on the matter, and she could give me none. This was a year or 2 before the date you signed for her statement, September 18, 1879. 2, the intimacy she says existed between Lambton and Rigdon. In all my investigation, I never found anyone who knew of this. All impressed me with the belief that it was Silas Ingalls with whom Rigdon was intimate. That Rigdon had a small tannery on Penn Street near hand for the manufacture of bookbinders, sheepskins, and supplying these to the office brought him in contact with Ingalls. This impression I obtained from John Sanderson, an old-time butcher who sold sheep pelts to Rigdon. I'm sorry you used Redditt McKee's statement for the reason that he subsequently made another, which conflicts with that you use, and the Mormons can use it with considerable effect to show how unreliable he is. Isaac Craig, Samuel Cooper's statement that your father's office was in the celebrated Molly Murphy's Row, otherwise Clapboard Row, is new to me. I never heard of it being any other place than 4th Street. Cooper, whom you say was a veteran of 3 wars, never smelled powder. The nearest he ever came to it was at Black Rock, where they all showed the white feather. I knew him well and was fond of listening to his yarns, but when I grew older I discovered that he was good at pulling the long bow. I agree with you that Parley P. Pratt was the man who brought Rigdon and Smith together. I think you might have used the statements of Isaac and Alva Hale in your closing remarks with good effect. I had some correspondence with Alva, and he sent me a book containing some matter relating to Joe Smith's operations before and after he married Emma Hale. They are quite interesting. Alva moved to northern Illinois within 30 miles of Plano, where his sister Emma Smith lived and died, but he did not know until I told him where she lived. He wrote me that Emma never forgave him for testifying against Joe. I suppose Alva is now dead, as he was very old when he wrote to me. Did George Plummer Smith ever tell you of his interview with Emma Smith? It is very important, but he imparted it to me in confidence. Perhaps now that Emma is dead, he might feel relieved from bond of silence for the public good. I think you should have mentioned that Hobart had been a Mormon. It is my impression that he and Mrs. Rigdon could tell all that is to be told in regards to the origin of the Mormon Bible. The silence of Mrs. Rigdon is very significant to me, but that old scamp Hobart is such a liar that anything he would say, unless corroborated, would have little weight. I was glad to learn that Reverend Ephraim Ehrenfeld enabled you so satisfactorily clear up the charge against John Cannon. I had a friend at Harrisburg who was going to investigate that very point. When he found friend Ehrenfeld was ahead of him, I am very much astonished at Albert's conduct in the matter. Sorry. And the positiveness of his statements induced me to believe he must have had good authority for his statement. His letter in the history of Washington County seems to me to be a very contemptible way of creeping out of the affair, for he really has no foundation for his charge. The articles he mentions does not in any manner implicate John Cannon. I confess I was too hasty when I wrote that I would not be surprised if it was true. The fact is, nearly all the prominent old settlers in Washington County have some queer antics in their records, and I'm never surprised at anything said of them. Your good old father was one of the few of whom nothing out of the proper line could be said. If my eyes get better this winter, I'm going to make a point to find that matter regarding John Cannon for my own, as well as yours, satisfaction. Please excuse the appearance of this note, as I can hardly see. Very truly, Isaac Craig. If you have 2 or 3 more copies of your article, I'd be glad to buy them for friends interested in the matter. And then Reverend Robert Du Bois of New London, Pennsylvania, under date of January 9th, 1879, writes, I entered the bookstore of Robert Patterson in Lambden in March 1818 when about 12 years old, and remained there until the summer of 1820. The firm had under its control the bookstore on 4th Street, a bookbindery, the printing office, not newspaper but job office, under the name of Butler in Lambden, entrance on Diamond Alley, and the steam paper mill on the Allegheny, under the name of Robert and Joseph Patterson. I knew nothing of Spalding then dead, or of his book, or of Sidney Rigdon. And Isaac King, a highly respected citizen of Library, Pennsylvania, and an old neighbor of Rigdon, states in a letter to the present writer dated June 14th, 1879, that Sidney lived on the farm of his father until the death of the latter in May 1810, and for a number of years afterwards, farming with very indifferent success. It was said he was too lazy and proud to make a good farmer. Received his education in a log schoolhouse in the vicinity, began to talk in public on religion soon after his admissions to the church, probably at his own instance, as there is no record of his licensure. Went to Sharon, Pennsylvania for a time, was there ordained as a preacher, but soon returned to his farm, which he sold June 26, 1823, to James Means, and about the time of the sale removed to Pittsburgh. Then Carville Rigdon, Rigdon's relative at Library, Pennsylvania, Carville Rigdon, his brother, and Peter Boyer, his brother-in-law, in a written statement dated January 27, 1843, certified to the facts and dates as above, stated in regard to his birth, schooling, uniting with the church, licensure, ordination, and settlement in Pittsburgh in 1822. Mr. Boyer, also in a personal interview with the present writer in 1879, positively affirmed that Rigdon had never lived in Pittsburgh previous to 1822, adding that they were boys together and he ought to know. Mr. Boyer had for a short time embraced Mormonism, but became convinced that it was a delusion and returned to his membership in the Baptist Church. He, Sidney Rigdon, was born on his father's farm, Piney Fork of Peters Creek, St. Clair Township, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, February 19, 1793, where he lived till the winter of 1818 and 1819. followed farming, and received a common English education. In the fall of 1817, he professed religion and joined the regular Baptist church of that place. And in the winter of 1818 and 19, when he went to Beaver County, Pennsylvania, where he studied divinity with a Baptist preacher by the name of Clark and was licensed to preach by the Connoquenessing Church, time not recollected, and went from there to Warren, Ohio, and was ordained a regular Baptist preacher and returned to Pittsburgh in the winter of 1821 and 22 and took care of the first regular Baptist church, and there continued to preach till the Baptist Association met in Pittsburgh. Precise time not recollected, but we think about the fall of 1824, at which time they brought some charges against him for not being sound in the faith, brought him to trial, but denied him the liberty of speaking in self-defense, and declared a non-fellowship with them, and began to preach cannibalism. And he and they that joined with him got the liberty of the courthouse. There they held their meetings, and he and his brother-in-law, Mr. Brooks, followed the tanning business till the winter of 1827-28, when Sidney Reed moved somewhere in the Western Reserve in Ohio, and there continued to preach till the Latter-day Saints came to that part of the country. And he joined them and continued to be an elder in that church of Latter-day Saints called Mormons. In confirmation of the above statements we hereby subscribe our names: Carville Rigdon, Peter Boyer. John Rigdon. About 1832, my father was preaching at Mentor, Ohio. Martin Harris and Albert Cowdery called upon him and presented to him the Book of Mormon and told him it was founded by Joseph Smith, engraved on gold plates, and that Smith translated the engravings, and the book was a true translation. That they had seen the plates, that Harris had written the translation given by Joseph Smith. They asked him to read it and give them his opinion of it. He gave them permission to preach in his church and went to hear them. At the close, he told the congregation that they had listened to some strange doctrine, but it was their duty to investigate. Cowdery and Harris next morning, but returned in about 6 weeks. They asked my father if he had read that book, and he said he had. They asked what he thought of it. He asked if Joseph Smith was a man of intelligence. Cowdery said Smith had about as much knowledge as he had. Father replied that if it was the case, Smith was not the author of the book. Some time after this, Father met Joseph Smith for the first time in the state of New York. After being in Smith's company for some time, he joined the Mormon Church, removed to Kirtland, and began preaching Mormonism. He afterward went to Missouri, thence to Nauvoo. After Smith's death, my father claimed it was his right to lead the church, but Brigham Young was chosen. In 1847, Father removed to Friendship, New York, where he remained until his death, July 14, 1876, aged 84. He retired to private life after removing to Friendship, would occasionally lecture. Large crowds always came out when it was announced he would speak. By his calm and dignified demeanor, he gained the respect of all. That was his son, Sidney Rigdon. In an answer to the statement of Clark Braden in Saints Herald under Christianity versus Mormonism, I have only to quote Horatio Seymour, who pronounced Rigdon a very eloquent man. Martin Grover, one of New York's greatest jurists, who said Sidney Rigdon's knowledge of the history of the world and the political history of our country was perfectly surprising to him, and that he was a very learned and eloquent man. Professor Hatch frequently said Rigdon was the best historian he ever saw and one of the most eloquent men he ever listened to. Also, Braden's statements about Rigdon's extravagant yarns, highfalutin rant, his visions of power while speaking and falling trances in the pulpit have no truth in them whatever. Sidney Rigdon was a devout Christian from his youth to his grave. He preached and taught the Bible on all occasions, when necessary, to his children and all. He died having a firm belief in the Christian religion. I never knew one who was a stronger believer in the Christian religion than he. I therefore pronounce such assertions as positively untrue. I am probably better acquainted with Sidney Rigdon than any living person. Had better opportunities through business and family relations to know the character, history, and religious belief than anyone else. Religion was his favorite theme. I'm returning from Salt Lake City in 1865, where I had interviews with the leading dignitaries of the Mormon Church at that place on the subject of Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. I asked my father to tell me the facts as to the production of this book. My father stated all he knew of the origin of the book was that what Harris, Cowdery, and Joseph Smith told him. That Smith, during the 15 years he was intimate with him, never stated anything else and that he had found it engraven on gold plates which he had found in a hill in New York. He said after investigation he was confident that the story about Spalding writing the Book of Mormon was untrue. He said the same story about his writing the book was false, and he never saw the book until it was presented to him by Oliver Cowdery at Mentor, Ohio. Knowing my father as I do, I am confident he told me the truth. My father never saw Solomon Spalding in his life, nor did he steal any of his manuscript, as stated by Braden. My mother survived my father about 10 years after father's death. In conversation with her about the Book of Mormon, she always told me that my father obtained it from Cowdery and Harris at Mentor, Ohio, and that the stories about father having written it were untrue. Father and mother told me this same story in my youth and manhood, and they told me in their old age, and they never told any other. I am not a member of any religious denomination, and do not pretend to say how that book came into existence. But I am as certain as I exist, that Sidney Rigdon never wrote any part of the Book of Mormon, and that he never saw it until Harris and Cowdery presented it to him at Mentor, Ohio. Nancy Rigdon, which is the daughter of Sidney Rigdon, learning that a daughter of Rigdon was living in Pittsburgh, a reporter called on her yesterday, and at first she declined to say anything at all on the subject. But finally, on the sky, promising not to use her name, she is married, she said, I have never had the honor of seeing the so-called Reverend Covert, who of late has been so free in his use of dead men's names, but I understand her part. He parts his hair in the middle of his head, a fact from which I have heard and read of him is no surprise to me. Now, while I am most emphatically declined to be drawn into any controversy over the story of Covert, which, if there was any foundation for it, I cannot for the life of me see why I was allowed to remain quiet for years after all the actors are laid in their graves. Yet I will say this, my father, who had the respect of all who knew him, and at a time when he had but little hope of living from one day to another, said to the clergymen around him, of which there was a number belonging to various denominations. These were his words, I expect to die and meet my Maker. I know nothing about where the manuscript of the Mormon Bible came from. The lady said further that she believed as firmly as she believed anything that Joseph Smith, who was, she believed at one time, a good man, had a revelation, and that the Mormon Bible was founded on that revelation. But she was satisfied the Reverend Covert had never seen a copy of it, and consequently did not know what he was talking and writing about. Now, we have presented a lot in the defense of Sidney Rigdon, as you can see from family members and from acquaintances. So, we want to look at innocent until proven guilty. And with regard to what we're going to see now, we're going to see that the the weight, the scale, the scales are about to tip, my friends. There's a lot of evidence that Joseph Smith is indeed the perpetrator. So, going back to Spalding again, we know that he did move to Pittsburgh. He lived there for about 2 years, in the autumn of 1812 to 1814. Then he went down to Amity and lived there for about 2 years. Now, Sidney Rigdon, he was born in St. Clair Township, Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, 1793. So that's 10 miles south of Pittsburgh. As you can see on this map here, it's about 10 miles. So there it is right there. And you can even see that they even know where the Rigdon farm was and how far away it was from Pittsburgh. So, you got to think about, did he live in the right place? And so what we want to look at now is what kind of man was Sidney Rigdon. And what you're going to see is when we develop this character sketch of him, that fits the description of someone who would indeed make up a new revelation. And you'll see that in just a moment as we travel through this. Now, we know we loved to read. Sidney was never to play with the boys. Reading books was the greatest pleasure he could get. Then it says Sidney Rigdon himself said about himself, he had an insatiable thirst for reading. Number 2, he believed he was called of God. Sidney Rigdon wrote to Stephen Post, says, "From his earliest infancy, my fear saith the Lord was a ruling principle in his heart. I, the Lord, called him from his plow, as I did Amos from among the herdsmen of Tekoa." Third, he was devoted to the study of the Bible. From his earliest infancy, fear of God was the ruling principle in his heart. In consequence of this, he was devoted to the study of the Bible. Number 4, he was deceptive. He made up his own conversion experience. Years later, as a Latter-day Saint, he reports on his former Baptist conversion. "When I joined the church, I knew I could not be admitted without an experience. So I made up one to suit the purpose, but it was all made up and was of no use." 5, he was an orator. Amos Hayden writes about him. "On my visits to Pittsburgh in those days, being a member and minister of the Redstone Baptist Association, I spoke to the Baptist church in that city. The result was that, with the exception of some 12 persons, the whole church, over 100 members, were theoretical reformers. In 1822, I induced Sidney Rigdon, then a Baptist minister of Ohio, to accept a call to the church in Pittsburgh." Number 6, his character. Alexander Campbell says about him, Rigdon was petulant, unreliable, ungovernable in his passions, and his wayward temper, his extravagant stories about his habit of self-assertion prevented him from attaining influence as a religious teacher among the disciples. Number 7, he was a Bible scholar. David Whitmer says Rigdon was a thorough Bible scholar, a man of fine education, and a powerful orator. He soon worked himself deep into Brother Joseph's affections and had more influence over him than any other man living. He was Brother Joseph's private counselor, his most intimate friend, and brother for some time after they met. Brother Joseph rejoiced, believing that the Lord had sent to him this great and mighty man, Sidney Rigdon, to help him in the work. A.W. Coase says he found in himself an insatiable thirst for reading. He read history, divinity, and general literature without much method or aim, except to gratify his intense love of reading. He gave attention to the Bible, made himself very familiar with all parts of it. He rarely committed to memory, and thus stored up large portions of the most attractive portions of the Bible. And then Alexander Campbell says Rigdon was a flaming literalist of the school of Elias Smith, a millenarian of the first water, in which the millennium is talked about in the Book of Mormon. Number 8, different mood swings may be due to an accident. Lamy Rigdon. He received such a contusion of the brain as ever afterwards seriously affected his character, and in some respects his conduct. His mental powers did not seem to be impaired, but the equilibrium of his intellectual exertions seems thereby to have been sadly affected. He still manifested great mental activity and power, but was to an equal degree inclined to run into wild and visionary views on almost every question. Alexander Campbell says he was peculiar, mental, and corporal malady. Had a peculiar mental and corporal malady. W. Weil says Sidney Rigdon spoke very rapidly and used to get tremendously excited so that he foamed at the mouth. Newell Whitney. I was well acquainted with Elder Rigdon a number of years before he came into this church. He was always either in the bottom of the cellar or up in the garret window. Jedediah Grant says Elder Rigdon would not only soar, as it were, to the highest heaven in raptures of delight, but when dark clouds overspread his horizon, he would also sink into the lowest states of despondency. Number 9, he thought of himself as a prophet. Rigdon said, I am going to fight a real bloody battle with sword and with gun. I will fight the battles of the Lord. I will also cross the Atlantic, encounter the Queen's forces, and overcome them, plant the American standard on English ground, and then march to the palace of Her Majesty and demand a portion of her riches and dominions, which if she refuse, I will take the little madam by the nose and lead her out, and she shall have no power to help herself. If I do not do this, the Lord never spake by mortal. And then the revelation is supposed revelation of Stephen Post. And now I, the Lord, call thee to a great work in assisting my servant Sidney Rigdon, preparing the way before me, and Elijah which should come. And I say unto thee, as my servant Sidney Rigdon assisted my servant Joseph Smith with all of his mighty hand and strength, I have called thee to assist my servant Sidney Rigdon, that I shall see my elect gathered in Zion redeemed, and thou shalt shout hosannas in the midst of my people, while Babylon shall shake and tremble, and the inhabitants thereof shall quake with fear, and howl, and weep, and mourn for anguish of soul. Even so, amen. Now, when you read Doctrine and Covenants, friend, that language is very similar to what we see written in Doctrine and Covenants. So it doesn't surprise me that if Sigmaringen did transform manuscript and Brown into Book of Mormon, which he was very capable of being a Bible scholar and had the talents to do so, but he could also imitate Scripture, and that's why you see in regards to Doctrine and Covenants how it could have came into being as well. And then he says, the words of the Lord which came to Phoebe, his prophetess, saying to his servant Stephen, beware, beware of pride, saith the Lord, in writing, for thou art in danger of falling under condemnation by reason of it. Do all things that thou doest in relation to Zion in great meekness and humility before me. I send you this as delivered to me by her whom the Lord has chosen and ordained to warn the sons of Zion when they are in danger. For I, the Lord, have decreed a consumption on all the regions of this country, laying between what you call the Atlantic on the east, and the Mississippi on the west, and between the Gulf of Mexico on the south, and the Great Lakes on the north, as is named among you. And I would further say to you, my servants, that it will be to your advantage, when you go to such a home, that you go as far west as the place known as Council Bluffs in Iowa. So when we put all this together, I mean, he loved to read. He believed he was called of God. He was devoted to the study of the Bible. He was deceptive because he made up his own conversion experience. He was an orator. Look at his character a little bit. He was a Bible scholar, had different mood swings, thought of himself as a prophet because he would make up scriptures that matched to the Bible, as you can see there in some of the examples we gave. So the profile of someone who would make manuscript found transfer into the Book of Mormon has the strong possibility of fitting Sidney Rigdon. So when we think about the connection between Spalding and Rigdon, there are several rebuttals that LDS apologists would give in the defense. One, Sidney Rigdon was neither employed nor connected with any print shop in Pittsburgh. Two, there's no evidence to indicate that Rigdon was ever in Pittsburgh before 1822. Rigdon denies in a letter he wrote to an editorial that he did not have any involvement with Solomon Spalding or his manuscript. That's the rebuttals that are usually given, and we want to look at those more closely. So if we think about the timeline, in 1812, Spalding moves to Pittsburgh. In 1816, Spalding died in Amity, Pennsylvania. 1830, the Book of Mormon is published. Now, the question is, could Sidney Rigdon have been there between 1812 and 1816? We know that he was there in Pittsburgh in 1822 because he started preaching for the First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh. But these are very critical years in those 4-year period from 1812 to 1816. The LDS argument is that Rigdon did not have the opportunity, nor was he at the right time and place to steal the manuscript because of that gap. So, is there a connection? Well, first we want to look at several witnesses. So we're going to mention here Rebecca Johnston Eichbaum. She says, my father John Johnson was postmaster at Pittsburgh for about 18 years, from 1804 to 1822. My husband, William Eightbaum, succeeded him and was postmaster for about 11 years, from 1822 to 1833. I was born August 25th, 1792. When I became old enough, I assisted my father in attending to the post office and became familiar with his duties. From 1811 to 1816, I was the regular clerk in the office, sorting, making up, dispatching, opening, and distributing the mails. Pittsburgh was in a small town, and I was well acquainted with all the state of visitors at the office who called regularly for their mails. So meager at that time were the mails that I could generally tell without looking whether or not there was anything for such persons, though I would usually look in order to satisfy them. I was married in 1815, and the next year my connection with the office ceased, except during the absences of my husband. I knew and distinctly remember Robert and Joseph Patterson, J. Harrison Lambden, Silas Ingalls, and Sidney Rigdon. I remember Reverend Mr. Spaulding, but simply as one who occasionally called to inquire for letters. I remember there was an evident intimacy between Lambden and Rigdon. They very often came to the office together. I particularly remember that they would thus come during the hour on Sabbath afternoon, when the office was required to be open, and I remember feeling sure that Reverend Mr. Patterson knew nothing of this, or he would have put a stop to it. So, what can we learn from her? She also says, I do not know what position, if any, Rigdon filled in Patterson's store or printing office, but am well assured that he was frequently, if not constantly, uh, there for a large part of the time when I was clerk in the post office. I recall Mr. Ingalls saying that Rigdon was always hanging around the printing office. He was connected with the tannery before he became a preacher, though he may have continued the business whilst preaching. So when we think about Mrs. Eightbaum, what do we see? We want her to see if she passes that four-part test. So the question is, was she present? And we're going to see in just a moment. Well, we do know that about her marriage. She says, I was married in 1815, and the next year my connection with the office ceased except during the absence of my husband. So October 28th, 1815 says, on the 12th, instituted by the Reverend Joseph Stockton, Mr. William Eightbaum, to the amiable Mrs. Rebecca Johnson, daughter of John Johnson, postmaster in this place. So that is right. And then she remembered a rule about the post office, which was Section 9 of the Post Office Law of April 30th, 1810. At post offices where the mail arrives on Sunday, the office would be kept open for the delivery of letters and for 1 hour after the arrival and a sorting of the mail. But in case that would interfere with the hours of public worship, then the office is to be kept open for 1 hour after the usual time of dissolving the meetings for that purpose. Remember what she said? She says, I remember there was an evident intimacy between Lambden and Rigdon. They very often came to the office together. I particularly remember that they would come during the hour on Sabbath afternoon when the office was required to be open. And then here's the interesting thing. Remember, we talked about this already, that they would display your name in the newspaper if you didn't come pick up your mail. So Solomon Spaulding is mentioned there, May 5th, 1813. Here we see Solomon Spaulding, November 10th, 1813. Look at Solomon Spaulding, September 4th, September 7th, 1814. February 4th, 1815. Notice John Spaulding and Solomon Spaulding on there. February 11th, 1815. Look how John Spaulding and Solomon Spaulding are on it. And then February 25th, 1815. John Spaulding again, and Solomon Spaulding. Or, I'm sorry. Now, here's the interesting one. July 9th, 1816. Notice this one very carefully. What does that say on the left-hand corner? says Sidney Rigdon, who's on the right, Solomon Spaulding. So you see, he did live in that area, lived in that during that time period in Pittsburgh. September 5th, 1815. Even there, Sidney Rigdon's name is mentioned. Then, just to let you know, November 7th, 1818. So, when we think about her testimony, what can we say? Well, was she present? Certainly is the case. She passes that. Was she corroborated? Was she accurate? Was she biased? We see she was present, and it does corroborate her testimony. She was accurate in the details, and when we think about, did she have any biases? I mean, what was her ulterior motive for giving a false testimony? And then Joseph Miller, who was very close to Spaulding and nursed him, he says, my recollection is that Spaulding left a transcript of the manuscript with Patterson for publication. The publication was delayed until Spaulding could write a preface. In the meantime, the manuscript was spirited away and could not be found. Spaulding told me that Sidney Rigdon had taken it, or was suspected of taking it. I recollect distinctly that Rigdon's name was mentioned in connection with it. And we kind of already did a test on him. And then there's John Winter. Now, it's very interesting what we learn about John Winter. He says MD was one of the early ministries uh, of the Baptist Church living in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. During a portion of the time when Sidney Rigdon was pastor of the First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, Dr. Winter was teaching a school in the same city and was well acquainted with Rigdon. Upon one occasion during this period, 1822 to 1823, Dr. Winter was in Rigdon's study when the latter took from his desk a large manuscript and said in substance, a Presbyterian minister, Spaulding, whose health had failed, brought this to the printer to see if it would pay to publish it. It is a romance of the Bible. Dr. Winter did not read any part of it and paid no more attention to it until after the Book of Mormon appeared, when he heard that Mr. Spaulding's widow recognized it in the writings of her husband. The authority for the above important statement is the Reverend A.G. Kirk, to whom Dr. Winter communicated in a conversation at New Brighton, Pennsylvania, 1870 1871. Dr. Winter died at Sharon, Pennsylvania, November 5th, 1878. Mr. Kirk, sorry about that. Mr. Kirk conveyed this information to the present writer by letter March 23, 1879. And Mary Irvin, the daughter of Winter, I frequently heard my father speak of Rigdon's having Spaulding's manuscript, and he had gotten it from the printers to read it as a curiosity. And as such, he showed it to my father, and that at the time Rigdon had no intention of making the use of it that he afterwards did. My father always said Rigdon helped Smith in his scheme by revising and making the Mormon Bible out of Reverend Spaulding's manuscript. And then A.J. Bonswell, preacher of the Baptist Church, Rochester, Pennsylvania, stepson of Dr. John Winter, confirmed Dr. Winter's statement. Then we also have Reddick McKee. So remember, Mr. McKee said, Mr. Spaulding told me that he had submitted the work to Mr. Patterson for publication, but for some reason it was not printed, and after we returned to him. I also understood he was then occasionally rewriting, correcting, and he thought improvising some passages descriptive of his supposed battles. In this connection, he spoke of the man Rigdon as an employee in the printing or bookbinding establishment of Patterson and Lambden in Pittsburgh. But about him I made no special inquiries. After consideration and further inquiry, he concluded to remove his family and that village, and did remove it in October 1814, rented the hotel and opened it as a public house but without a bar. Mr. Spaulding told me that while at Pittsburgh, he frequently met a young man named Sidney Rigdon at Mr. Patterson's bookstore and printing office and concluded that he was at least an occasional employee. He was said to be a good English and Latin scholar and was studying Hebrew and Greek with a view to a professorship in some college. He had read parts of the manuscript and expressed the opinion that it would sell readily. While the question of printing was in abeyance, Mr. Spaulding wrote to Mr. Patterson that if the document was not already in the hands of the printer, he wished to be sent out to him in order that he might amend it by the addition of a chapter on the discovery of valuable relics in a mound recently opened near Conduit. In reply, Mr. Patterson wrote to him that the manuscript could not then be found, but that further search would be made for it. This excited Mr. Spaulding's suspicions that Rigdon had taken it home. In a week or two, it was found in the place where it had originally been deposited and sent out to him. The circumstance of this finding increased Mr. Spaulding's suspicions that Rigdon had taken the manuscript and made a copy of it with a view to ultimately publish the story as a product of his own brain. Whether the manuscript was amended and returned to Mr. Patterson, he did not tell me, but it probably was. Then we have Amarillo Dunlap, who was a niece of Sidney Rigdon. She says, when I was quite a child, I visited Mr. Rigdon's family. He married my aunt. They at that time lived in Bainbridge, Ohio. During my visit, Mr. Rigdon went to his bedroom and took from a trunk, which he kept locked, a certain manuscript. He came out in the other room and seated himself by the fireplace and commenced reading it. His wife at that moment came into the room and exclaimed, "What? You're studying that thing again?" or something to that effect. She then added, "I mean to burn that paper." He said, "No, indeed you will not. This will be a great thing some day." Whenever he was reading this, he was so completely occupied that he seemed entirely unconscious of anything passing around him. Then there was Cephas Dodd, who gave secondhand testimony. Cephas Dodd, who died January 16, 1858, was long the pastor of the Presbyterian Church at Amity. He also practiced as a physician, and in this capacity attended Mr. Spaulding in his last illness. Of his testimony, Mr. George French, now in his 83rd year, residing near Amity, and whose wife was a relative of Sidney Rigdon, retains a vivid impression. Shortly after Mr. French's removal from Fayette County, Pennsylvania, to Amity in 1832, when the Mormon delusion was beginning to excite remark, Dr. Dodd took Mr. French to Spaulding's grave and there told him his positive belief that Rigdon was the agent in transforming Spaulding's manuscript into the Book of Mormon. The conviction thus expressed within 2 years after the publication of the Book of Mormon and 3 years before the appearance of Mr. Howe's book, which attributed the plagiarism to Rigdon, shows that Dr. Dodd's judgment was formed independently of any of the testimonies cited above. As to the plagiarism, it must have been based on his own knowledge of Spaulding's romance and comparing it with the Book of Mormon. And as to the agent, his attention, like Mr. Miller's, may first have been directed to Rigdon by Spaulding himself. Mr. French has no personal knowledge of Rigdon's connection with the printing office. Then we have Harvey Baldwin, who also has secondhand testimony. Says that over 30 years ago, he heard his father say that he belonged to the Baptist Church in Bainbridge, Portage County, Ohio, when Sidney Rigdon preached there, and that several times when he called to see Rigdon, he found him in a room by himself, and that he each time hurriedly put away books and papers he had as though he did not wish him to see them. Deacon Clapp of the church Garfield attended and Mentor says he was 18 years old when Rigdon came to Mentor to live, and that he had a large chair with a leaf on the arm to write on with a drawer underneath, with a lock and key. The chair was covered with spots of ink. Rigdon told him he had much use for it. In the year 1818, I was principal of the Onondaga Valley Academy and resided in the house of William Sabine, Esquire. I remember Mrs. Spaulding, Mr. Sabine's sister, perfectly, and hearing her and the family talk of a manuscript in her possession, which her husband, the Reverend Mr. Spaulding, had written somewhere in the West. I did not read the manuscript, but its substance was so often mentioned in the peculiarity of the story. The years afterward, when the Mormon Bible was published, I procured a copy and at once recognized the resemblance between it and Mrs. Spaulding's account of the manuscript found. I remember also to have heard Mr. Sabine talked of the romance and that he and Mrs. Spaulding said it had been written in the leisure hours of an invalid who read it to his neighbors for their amusement. Mrs. Spaulding believed that Sidney Rigdon had copied the manuscript while it was in Patterson's printing office in Pittsburgh. She spoke of it with regret. I never saw her after her marriage to Mr. Davidson of Hartwick and Treadwell, Redfield. Likewise, she, Matilda Davidson, Solomon Spaulding's widow, informed me that soon after they arrived at Pittsburgh, a man followed them. I do not recollect his name, but he was afterwards known to be a leading Mormon. He got into the employment of a printer, and he told the printer about my brother's composition. That's from Josiah Spaulding, which was secondhand testimony from the widow of Spaulding. Then we have C.E. Henry, who also had secondhand testimony. Other engagements prevented my hearing President Fairchild's lecture last evening upon the Book of Mormon and its relation to the Spaulding manuscript. It has been the popular belief among the older citizens of the Reserve, and especially among those who had personal observation and contact with early Mormonism, that the Book of Mormon was compiled or rewritten, or at least made up in part from the Spaulding document, and yet there was no direct or positive evidence to prove it. From some facts and incidents connected with the career of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon when they were in Geauga and Portage counties preaching their alleged new gospel, I came to the conclusion some years ago that the Book of Mormon was the work of Sidney Rigdon, with perhaps some changes or additions by Smith or others. So far as I know, these facts and circumstances have never been published. George Wilbur, one of the early pioneers of Geauga County, taught school in the winter following the alliance of Smith and Rigdon in a log schoolhouse a mile south of the center of Bainbridge. Rigdon lived in a log house about 200 yards from the schoolhouse, and young Wilbur, who has heard Rigdon preach before his alliance with Smith, often called on him during the noon hour of recess and sometimes in the evening. Rigdon had acquired the reputation of being something of a biblical scholar among the pioneers, and was also a very persuasive and eloquent preacher. Some of the keen-sighted people, however, had lost confidence in him. They discovered that he had a strong religious ambition that was not tempered by Christian grace and humility. For a year or more before the advent of Smith, they saw that Rigdon was bent on devising some new dogma, in short, to start a new church or sect that he could call his own, or whose leadership he would share with only a few. He goes on to say, it may be proper to state that George Wilbur was at that time a young man of high character and good education, and for more than 40 years no one in Geauga or Portage had a better reputation for truth and moderation. He was the father of Professor C.D. Wilbur, now of Nebraska, who was a roommate of General Garfield at Williams College. He died about 4 years ago at Aurora, Illinois. Wilbur's statement, moreover, of the work and conduct of Rigdon that winter was corroborated by some of the neighbors in the school district. Rigdon did not preach that winter, but was almost constantly engaged upon a manuscript that he was writing or revising. Wilbur noticed that towards the close of the term, there was much more of it than there was the first time he saw it. Rigdon had before that time been free and communicative, especially upon religious topics. He now appeared reserved and at times reticent. Whenever he referenced about his manuscript, he seemed disposed to parry inquiry by some general explanation that he was making notes or preparing some papers to throw light upon some portions of the gospel. The following spring, Smith appeared, and he and Rigdon went off together and were gone some months. It was reported that they had gone to Pittsburgh, but whether true or not, no one could say. It was generally believed, however, that Smith at least visited western New York before either returned to Ohio. Soon after the return, the Book of Mormon was announced. Smith was mysterious and silent, assuming familiarity with the supernatural. It was difficult to measure or discover his powers or qualities because of his silence and professions as a prophet. It did not take long, however, to see that he had failed to measure properly those masterly powers of his companion in acting the part of the prophet. In a few months he saw that he must take a subordinate part and from that time onward his zeal flagged. He drifted along, though still a leader, until the death of Smith, when he found that Brigham Young, a natural leader of the class of men who composed their followers, held the reins of power with a strong hand. Reagan became disgusted and disheartened. He soon left them forever and died some years ago in Pennsylvania. 10 years ago this winter I spent 2 weeks in Salt Lake City. Elder Orson Pratt had been for many years a historian or theologian of the Mormon Church. As my father had been acquainted with him in his younger days, I called upon him and made myself known. He was an old man of about 80 years. During our conversation, I inquired of him why it was that his people crossed what was called the Great Desert and settled at Salt Lake. He replied that they had Fremont's narrative, and that he carried a copy during their journey over the plains and mountains. In the history of the Mormon Church, it is stated that Pratt was with the advance guard, and on their arrival at Salt Lake, Pratt made observations and found the latitude and longitude. Soon after the interview, I examined a copy of Fremont's narrative and found the latitude and longitude given. Now, Pratt was not scholar enough to take an observation of that kind, so he must have announced their locality from the information given by Fremont. It is due to Elder Pratt to say that I do not believe he wrote this statement. He was more of a custodian of Mormon records than a historian, and probably permitted the statement to be made. The Book of Mormon contains many internal evidences that Sidney Rigdon was the author of at least a good portion of it. How many others had a hand in it, or what other manuscript, if any, assisted in the work, it would be difficult now to determine. C. E. Henry. Now, I want to point out there's a lot of mistakes Henry makes, and we ought to point them out. Rigdon only lived in Bainbridge, Ohio between 1826 and 1827. Wilbur teaching in the winter following the alliance of Smith and Rigdon would make it 1831. 2. Henry says Rigdon did not preach that winter, but Rigdon did, as historical information is available for those facts. 3. Henry says Smith arrived in Bainbridge to see Rigdon in the spring of 1827, but Rigdon had moved to Mentor, Ohio in the March of 1827. And Henry says Smith and Rigdon went off together for several months, and that soon after their return, the Book of Mormon was announced. Well, A. Rigdon took a preaching job at Mentor, which involved him taking over duties as a preacher, and B. The earliest accounts of the Book of Mormon's forthcoming would be in the spring of 1829, which is 2 years away from Henry's statement. And I thought that Cowdery Davis and Bennett made some good points there regarding his mistakes that he made. 12. Dempsey Thompson. We are in receipt of a letter from Mr. O.P. Henry, an Astoria subscriber, who says in reference to an article in the Oregonian of recent date concerning the origin of the Mormon Bible, that his mother, who is yet alive, lived in the family of Sidney Rigdon for several years prior to her marriage in 1827, that there was in the family what is now called a writing medium, also several others in adjacent places, and the Mormon Bible was written by 2 or 3 different persons by an automatic power which they believed was inspiration direct from God, the same as produced the original Jewish Bible and Christian New Testament. Mr. H. believed that Sidney Rigdon furnished Joseph Smith with these manuscripts, and that the story of the hieroglyphics was a fabrication to make the credulous take a hold of the mystery, that Rigdon, having learned beyond a doubt that the so-called dead could communicate to the living, considered himself duly authorized by Jehovah to found a new church under divine guidance, similar to that of Confucius, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Swedenborg, Calvin, Luther, or Wesley, all of whom believed in and taught the ministration of spirits. Then we have all R.W. Otterman, secondhand testimony. February 1852, I was snowbound in a hotel in Mentor, Ohio all day. Martin Harris was there, and the conversation told me he saw Joe Smith translate the Book of Mormon with his peepstone in his hat. Oliver Cowdery, who had been a schoolteacher, wrote it down. Sidney Rigdon, a renegade preacher, was let in during the translation. Rigdon had stolen a manuscript from a printing office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which Spalding, who had written it in the early part of the century had left there to be printed, but the printers refused to publish it, but Joe and Rigdon did as the Book of Mormon. Martin said he furnished the means, and Joe promised him a place next to him in the church. When they had got all my property, they set me out. He said Joe ought to have been killed before he was, that the Mormons committed all sorts of depredations in the towns about Kirtland. They called themselves Latter-day Saints, but he called them Latter-day Devils. William Smith, secondhand testimony. William Smith, brother of Joseph Smith, told Joseph if he did not give him some money, he would tell where the Book of Mormon came from. And Joseph, accordingly, gave him what he wanted. G.B. Frost. Then we have John C. Bennett. I will remark here, in confirmation of the above, that the Book of Mormon was originally written by the Reverend Solomon Spaulding as a romance and entitled The Manuscript Found and placed by him in the printing office of Patterson and Lambden in the city of Pittsburgh, from whence it was taken by a conspicuous Mormon divine and remodeled by adding the religious portion placed by him in Smith's possession, and then published into the world as the testimony exemplifies. This I have from the Confederation, and of its perfect correctness there is not the shadow of a doubt. There never were any plates of the Book of Mormon, excepting what were seen by the spiritual, and not the natural eyes of the witnesses. Story of the plates is all chimerical. Now, you ought to read about John C. Bennett and his book, The History of the Saints. It's very interesting reading there. And number 16, James Jeffrey. I know more about the Mormons than any man east of the Alleghenies, although I have given no attention to the matter for 25 years. I did not know I was in possession of any information concerning the Book of Mormon, unknown to others. I suppose that as Rigdon was so open with me, he had told others the same thing. 40 years ago I was in business in St. Louis. The Mormons then had their temple in Nauvoo. I had business transactions with them. Sidney Rigdon I knew very well. He was general manager of the affairs of the Mormons. Rigdon, in hours of conversation, told me a number of times there was in the printing office with which he was connected in Ohio a manuscript of Reverend Spaulding, tracing the origin of the Indian race from the lost tribes of Israel. That this manuscript was in the office for several years, that he was familiar with it, that Spaulding had wanted it printed, but had not the money to pay for the printing, that he, Rigdon, and Joe Smith used to look over the manuscript and read it over Sundays. Then number 17, Matilda Davidson. This Mr. Spaulding refused to do for reasons which I cannot now state. Sidney Rigdon, who has figured so largely in the history of the Mormons, was at this time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson, as is well known in that region. And as Rigdon himself has frequently stated, here he had ample opportunity to become acquainted with Mr. Spaulding's manuscript, and to copy it if he chose. So, friends, what I decided to do is make a map and just to show you some interesting things about this matter. So here we have in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, this is where Spaulding went, and he wanted to get his book, Manuscript Found, published, right? And who do we have? We got Rebecca Eightbaum. We got John Winter. Of course, his second hand. Remember, John Winter was the one who saw it, that Reagan took it out of his desk and showed it to him around 1822 to 1823. Rebecca Eightbaum worked in the post office, said she saw Sidney Rigdon come in. She saw Solomon Spaulding come in, and they both had mail there at the post office in Pittsburgh. Then there's Amity, Pennsylvania. Of course, we know that he moved there. Spalding moved there from 1814 to 1816, where he was evidently, he had to put security money on the printed manuscript, to be printed manuscript, but he also had to revise it, and evidently he did revise it because he wanted to write a chapter about relics and from Conduit and stuff of that nature. And Joseph Miller, Reddick McKee, and Matilda Davison talk about that. Now, whether it was copied and then brought back, returned, or whether it was stolen outright, it's hard to determine from that. But then, interesting enough, we got Bainbridge, Ohio. And in Bainbridge, Ohio, who do we have? We have Amarillo Dunlap, the niece of Sidney Rigdon, and Dency Thompson, who lived with his family for a while. And then you got Nauvoo, Illinois, where one of the places where the Mormon Church set up for quite a while. And John C. Bennett, he became a Mormon, and he was high up in the Mormon Church, and he wrote and exposed and says, "Hey, I know for the truth of the matter that even from the Confederation, which was the main leaders of the Mormon Church, so to speak, that it was actually Solomon Spaulding's book that was transformed into the Book of Mormon." And then we have even St. Louis, Missouri, from James Jeffries, who says, and we can imagine that when you think about Sidney Rigdon, he got mad because he didn't get the leadership position, but Brigham Young got it. Then it's easy to see why he let his tongue slip, and where he actually told where the Book of Mormon came from and stuff. So he told James Jeffrey that, and so you have all this together, and they talk about one man, Sidney Rigdon. I mean, pretty strong circumstantial evidence, it seems to me. But we want you to join us next time for more.